Welcome to When the Dutch Went to Space, episode 11, in which we shall visit the moon multiple times, orbit Mars, and we're going to wrap up our lunar landing program and answer the old question, is the moon made of cheese? You know, as Dutch, we just had to know if the moon was made out of cheese, so we sent up like a lot of probes, like really a lot. And this wrapped in a ton of science. So I'm not going to show you each individual mission. I'm going to show you a compilation. In June 66, Luyten number 2, followed by number 3 in September and number 4 in 65. So it's actually spanning a couple of years. All of our probes target the so-called mares, or seas. You may have heard of that, like the Sea of Tranquility. And these darker areas on the moon were called seas because early astronomers thought they were water basins, and that's why they're still called seas. And obviously they don't contain any water, or maybe fractions of frozen water brought there by comets rather than lakes. We just have to figure out if it's made of good old Gouda. And we also decided to pack a lot of more instruments on it, which is going to be disastrous. In the lower right corner you can see Luyten number 7. And we actually built 2 more in 66, but all of them failed either mid-flight during an engine burn or during a landing. And the USSR has also landed its probe in 66, and USA will follow in June with Surveyor. And Surveyor is interesting. Scott Manley did a great video on how the probe figured out its orientation. So you can see our probes going into orbit first and then going for a landing, but they went for a direct landing. So to figure out if their spacecraft is oriented like orthogonally to the surface of the moon, they had radars in each of the legs, and they would send pulses like sinoids back to the moon, and then they would bounce back up. And if these would be if the spacecraft would be an angle, one of the waves would travel a little bit longer, and you get a shift in frequency, which I think Scott talks about Doppler. I'm not sure if it's exactly Doppler. I think it's frequency shift. But it's brilliant because you can build this with an analog computer. So regardless, we went to the moon. We got a ton of data back. And despite of that, our rate of progress is really slowing down because we have funding issues again. And that's because we're aiming for lunar landing and space stations, and we need bigger launch complexes, and we need to upgrade our program office. Yeah, that turned out to be a thing. It's important to upgrade your program office when you're doing version 2 of RP-1 because it allows you to run multiple programs simultaneously, and that will lead to more funding, and yeah, that brings everything together, but it comes at a cost. Well, you can see our probes slowly making their way towards the surface of the moon. And the last one even used newer landing engines that have variable thrust rather than our traditional hoovering. When I designed the Luyten spacecraft, I packed 30 kilograms of science payload, so I put a little weight on it saying 30 kilograms, and with the idea that I could add instruments to it at a later stage. This is also why in the previous episode you saw the spacecraft hovering. And in the later versions I swapped this dummy weight out, or filled the space that was given by the dummy weight with additional instruments, but apparently my trajectories were less efficient and test flight basically decides to play havoc. So in total we sent 8 probes to the moon and 4 of them landed successfully. And that's already a lot of science coming back in, and we have an idea of putting a rover on there in the future, but for now I think we're doing great. You can see them coming down at various craters in the mares, and one of them actually lands back on the dark side of the moon, which is a strange name, dark side, because it's not really dark, it's the face of the moon that we never see, because the moon rotates at exactly the same speed as it traverses around the globe. So you will always be seeing the same face of the moon, but it doesn't mean that the other end of the moon is dark. It just means you can't see it from Earth. And the Russians actually photographed that first with Luna 3. So, and there's an interesting story when it comes to that. So let's talk about photographing the moon, because that's an important thing, which brings us to Hugens. And this is the Mars orbiter. And I forgot this launch almost. This is a really important one. Like the Hugens 4 Mars Orbiter, yes, we renamed the Tonka series of early space probes to more functional deep space probes. And with this reconfiguration or rebuild, we also decided on a new naming scheme. It's named after Christian Huygens, of course, which was maybe the best known Dutch scientist ever. Like, he lived in the 17th century and he made great discoveries in maths and physics and astronomy, and in fact he was the very first to combine physics and math, leading to theoretical physics. And as a person myself, when I was in school, I never cared too much about mathematics until I discovered you can actually apply it in physics and use it to explain or predict certain phenomena. And things like Fourier analysis or signal analysis. Fourier analysis is super boring. At least I found it super boring. Maybe your mileage may vary. But I found it very boring until I started working with radar signals and signal-to-noise ratios and trying to hunt for carrier signals and discover what is out there. And in that particular field, Fourier analysis is super important. So, Christian also discovered the rings of Saturn. Well, he didn't discover the rings of Saturn. Galileo discovered the rings of Saturn. But nobody could actually explain why Saturn seemed to have these ear-shaped semicircles next to it. Because if you look through a telescope, and an early telescope, you can only see kind of a C shape or crescent shape around the round dot that represents the planet. And nobody could really explain it until Christian came up with this idea of a circle of tiny moons that would form into a disk. And maybe his best invention would be the swinging clock. I'm not sure if that's a proper translation. Probably isn't. Like the clock you would use in sea travel, because it helps you. If you have a very accurate clock, you can use this as a guidance system and figure out where you are. And I think that's his most important invention. He also invented a solid fuel rocket engine, so I think it's very appropriate. Anyway, you can see it launch here on a standard Europa 1 launcher, and we're at the hypergolic stage. So we're making great pace, and we're putting the probe into orbit. The probe itself weighs, together with the transfer stage, around 7 tonish. I think it's a little bit lighter than 7 tons, almost 6.7, something like that. I try to keep my payloads a little bit below the capability of the launch vehicle. So if we have some problems with some of the engines, which we have had in the past, and the engine is underperforming, we can actually use the extra delta V that we have to compensate for that. But none of these things are happening right now, and you can see our trusty Delta 7 engine pushing the third and final stage of the Europa rocket towards orbital velocity. And the Cruyff kick stage is sitting over here using a Gamma engine. The Gamma engine is using the vacuum optimized variant. Unfortunately, the model isn't really that good for it. It's using the exact same model, but anyway. It should light up in a moment and send our craft into interplanetary stage. So this is the Mars orbiter, and this is way ahead of its time. So this is probably a decade ahead of its time. We're going for Mars orbit with this one. The 4th of April 1965, Chandra number 4. Yeah, you would almost forget that we still have a functional launch complex over in Texel in the Netherlands. And you have seen so many launches now from our Surya launch complex in the Molucca in Indonesia that we almost forgot we had a second one. So you're looking at a trusty NL4 rocket carrying almost to the maximum of its payload. So the lunar program actually has an additional contract in there which requires us to put a camera up there, and we hadn't really unlocked that technology. So though the vehicle was ready and we actually launched Chandra 3 by accident, or not by accident, but it had the wrong camera on it. So we're doing the same mission profile again, but now with better science. Yeah. So fun fact, this thing is going to make camera images of the moon, and remember I told you about the USSR being the first person or country to actually photograph the moon, and then the dark side of the moon, or the non-Earth facing side of the moon. And as the Soviets were preparing the mission and they were getting ready for the mission, they realized at some point that the technology that they were using would not function. So the way they did is they were not sure if they could build a camera that would run in the temperatures of open space or even in the lack of an atmosphere. So what they did is they built a pressurized container for the probe to be in, and the camera would be inside this pressurized container, and it would take photos of the moon by orienting the spacecraft. Then it would spit out the film, because it was still using traditional film. This film would be developed on board. You were having this small laboratory on board. And maybe you're old enough to remember that this was a thing back in the day, and you had this red light rooms where you would actually develop film and see the image come to light. So they had this on the spacecraft, and then it would be read out by a scanner and sent back line by line to Earth. And so Luna 3, they realized they didn't have radiation-proof film. But at the same time, the US had this technology in place, and they were actively using a better quality film in their spy balloons that they were sending over Russia. Yeah, you remember the incident a couple of years back when they shot down Chinese balloons? Well, they did pretty much the same over at the USSR. And they took the film, the US film, and they cut it to Russian size or size fit for the space probe, and actually used a US film on that particular space probe. So yeah, first pictures of the moon made by Russia, powered by the US. Interesting. Anyway, you can see our trusty upper stage needing a little bit more time than the Luyten spacecraft to get aligned, and this is because we of course are firing in an inclined orbit. We are at 54 degrees or 53 point something, and we have to be careful that we don't hit our upper stage. Ooh. Yeah, zipping by. So we have to wait until the moon actually passes through our descending or ascending nodes, and those nodes we will actually boost toward it. And we're using the RCS on the transfer stage to get closer to the moon, and we're putting her in a polar orbit rather than a more equatorial orbit. And this is because we want to be able to get all this juicy science from all those biomes that live over there. And you can see the probe flying over the surface of the moon. You can also see that my GPU is suffering. So it's a trade-off between, do you want to have everything very fluid, or do you want to have the best graphics? And I opted for the best graphics, and yeah, sometimes when you have to render up, you come into lower space, which is below 150 kilometers on the moon. It will load a new set of textures, and that definitely slows down your whole computer, but it only takes a couple of seconds, and I just love the detail that's in there. Anyway, we see the craft capturing around the moon, and after that she will reorient to the moon. This is the new science instrument, very beautiful, tucked in the back, and you also see a new magnetometer meeting, so we're gonna get a lot of science out of this and get ready for maybe manned expeditions to the moon. But before that, you can see almost the same bus, Huygens C4, entering orbit of Mars. Yes, on the 5th of June in 1965, we make that 6 years before the US and the USSR will achieve that feat. And the orbiter is basically similar to what we used on Tonka. It has a beefed up transmitter, meaning that You may remember that we suffered from not being able to transmit directly from Mars. Tonka A2 is still transmitting its data from its Mars flyby. So every time it comes back into range of Earth, it will start transmitting a little bit of data, and then we'll get out of range again. So this craft will stay in contact with the Earth, and you can see it connecting, but it will run out of power. So see you again next time.